Often we are interested in being able to order numbers from least to greatest if we're trying to compare values, and so we are going to learn how to do that with decimal numbers now. One way to compare numbers or order numbers is to use the less than or greater than sign. So in this case, we're going to replace the box with the greater than or less than sign. And when we do this with decimals, we're really just comparing place values. So I'm comparing the tenths place to the tenths place, which is identical, and the hundredths to the hundredths, which is identical, and then the thousandths to the thousandths, and then the 10,000s to the 10,000s, and the 100,000s to the 100,000s. And notice up to this point, everything's been identical. And now this next place value, I have a 5 and I have a 6. And obviously 6 is greater than 5. And so this is the larger value. So I would put a less than sign because remember it's pointing to the one that is less than. In negative values, you have to be careful because remember the negatives sort of work opposite as the normal numbers. So if I were looking at this in a positive way, I would say that this 5 and this 6 would make this value larger. But because this is negative, that means this is the bigger negative number. It's more negative. And so I would actually, this would be the greater value because it's not as negative. It's a smaller negative number. So let's try these together. These are ordering. Again, some of these are going to be very, very easy. We're going to start with a negative example. And remember, from least to greatest would mean you would start with the most negative number first. So my most negative number is my largest negative number, -4 and 28/100ths. Then I would go to -3 and 76/100ths, and then -1 and 22/100ths, and then -1 and -254,000ths. Not a bad idea to put that 0 in there. So this one was not difficult except for the fact that it was a negative, and so it goes kind of in the opposite way that we would if it were positive. For my next example, however, notice that all of these values are very close to one another. So in looking at these, I start with the 1, obviously, and each of them has a 1. Then I look at the 2, and the 2, and the 2, and we'll come back to that one. That one's obviously going to be my biggest because it's got a 3. The rest of these have a 2. So now I'm comparing the 5 and the 0 and the 8 and the 2. So I would start with 1.2 because 0 is the least of those numbers. And then again, I'm looking at the 5, 8, or 2. 2 would be next. And now I'm looking at the 5 or the 8. And the 5 would be next. And now I'm looking at just the 8, so 1.28, and then of course 1.3. So you would compare them by turning them into decimals and then comparing place values till you get to ones that are different. Here are 2 questions for you to try on your own. So press pause, try both questions, then press play to see how you did. For my first example, I have very similar numbers. Notice we're dealing with the negatives. So in this case, in order to be the greater number, it actually is sort of the less number. So looking at 0 and 0, those match up exactly, and 4 and 4 and 4 and 4. So I'm really comparing the 5 to the 6. Now 5 is less than 6, but in this case that's a good thing because it's a negative number, so it's not as negative. So that is the greater value. For my next example, writing from least to greatest, again, there's a lot of 5s going on, a lot of 0s, so just pay attention to the place values. They obviously all have 0 to begin with, so let's look at the tenths place. A tenths place of 0 versus 5 versus 5 versus 0 versus 5. So these two are my smallest numbers. Let's see which one is the smallest between the two. This has a 5 in the hundredths place, so does this. This has a 5 in the thousandths place. This doesn't have anything, which means it's a 0, which means this number is smaller. So 0.05 and then 0.055 because this number is actually 5 thousandths larger than this number. Now let's move on to the ones that have a 5 in the tenths place. Again, not a bad idea to add some zeros if you need to, just for reference. So we know they all have a 0.5, so a 5 in the tenths. In the hundredths, I have a 0 and a 5 and a 5. So obviously this one's going to come next, 0.5. And then I'm comparing this one, which is 55 hundredths, to this one, which is 555 thousandths. This is 550 thousandths versus 555 thousandths. So this one's going to come next. It is a smaller number. Oops, extra 0. So that would be my least to greatest.